Little Women was the book that changed Louisa Alcott's life and made her rich and famous, but she didn't want to write it. She didn't want to write it at all. It was the last thing on earth she wanted to do. She approached it in a rage with tremendous reluctance, and she came to that point through a series of what seemed like unfortunate accidents and discouragement. And one of the things that fascinates me about her life and our lives is the way when you look back on your life, it looks like destiny. But when you look forward, it looks like a series of unfortunate accidents. Louisa May Alcott came from an extraordinary family. She was 36 years old when she sat down to write Little Women in 1868. She was the second daughter of 4 daughters in a family living in and around Boston. Her father was a visionary and something of a jerk named Bronson Alcott. He was a progressive educator who had married an aristocrat without much money. Bronson was actually an education genius. He believed that children came from God, as Wordsworth had said a few years earlier. Most people in those days thought that children were vipers who had to be tamed and civilized in order to fit in with society. Bronson felt that they trailed clouds of glory. And so his schools, of course, were tremendously popular because instead of beating the children and forcing them to memorize things, he had fun with them and taught them in a way that seems much more congenial to us now, but was very revolutionary then. And the first students that he had were his own children. He was fascinated by children. He felt he was a student of children. And of course, he used his own 4 daughters as if they were lab rats. He did his first clinical trials on Louisa and her sisters. And I'm going to read a couple of paragraphs. I'm going to go back and forth between reading and talking this evening. And let me also say it's an honor and a pleasure to be in this room where I've spent so many happy hours watching the dust motes come across the afternoon light and wondering why I wasn't upstairs working on my book. Okay, in one experiment, and now I'm reading, Bronson produced an apple just before dinner time when his subjects were especially hungry and asked Anna, that's the older sister, pointedly if little girls should take things that did not belong to them without asking. No, Anna responded obediently, they should not. Then he asked both Anna and Louisa if they would ever do such a thing as take an apple without asking for it. They both agreed that they would not. Yet, when Bronson returned to the room after dinner, the apple had been reduced to a core next to Louisa's place at the dinner table. Bronson asked what it was. Apple, admitted the honest Louisa. Remember, she's 3 years old. Anna, always the pleasing child, blurted out the whole story. A story in which she and Louisa had both tried to get the apple, but Louisa had gotten there first. Then Louisa had eaten some of it. Anna had grabbed it and thrown it into the grate, but Louisa had fished it out and eaten some more. Louisa, as usual, was the villain of the piece. Bronson always believed Anna. Louisa confessed that she had eaten the apple because I wanted it. Then, sensing that she had somehow failed, she added, I was naughty. In another apple experiment, Bronson left an apple on the wardrobe alone with Louisa, who put up a valiant struggle as her father and mother secretly listened and took notes. During the course of the morning, Louisa's mother reported that she several times took the apple in her hands and caressed it wistfully. No, no, fathers, me not take father's apple. Naughty, naughty, she said. Then she succumbed and ate the apple. When confronted by her mother, she explained, me could not help it. You must have it. So you can see what kind of child she was from the beginning and what kind of parents she had. They were all over their daughters, and Louisa was the naughty one. Bronson was very thrilled to see that she actually had a conscience. She knew when she was being naughty, but she was definitely the renegade from the beginning. And she also was the one with the dark hair, which Bronson believed meant you were satanic. And just another note about why some people think Bronson was a jerk. Bronson provided his daughters and his wife with an amazing community in which to live. Although they moved 30 times, they were incredibly poor. They often didn't have enough to eat, Bronson's friends were Henry David Thoreau and Ralph Waldo Emerson and Nathaniel Hawthorne, so that although Louisa didn't go to school very much, she grew up in this unbelievably rich intellectual atmosphere. She used Emerson's library the way we use this library, and Thoreau took her for walks and taught her about nature. So this unbelievable transcendental community in which she grew up was really a gift from her father. And, you know, one of the things about Bronson, he had all these fancy, wonderful, smart friends, and they all revered him. And Bronson was a great conversationalist, but he was a terrible writer. Somebody once said, and this came as a shock to everybody, because apparently he was quite an impressive guy till you asked him to write an essay, and then you were very sorry. Somebody said that reading Bronson's prose was like watching 15 boxcars go by with only one passenger in them. And James Russell Lowell even wrote a poem about how Bronson couldn't write. While he talks, he is great, but goes out like a taper if you shut him up closely with pen, ink, and paper. And it goes on like that. So Bronson famously was a bad writer, and he became more and more famous for his bad writing as the years went on. And at first, it looked as if Louisa was also a bad writer. Here's a story which you've heard part of, but Louisa had decided very early on that she wanted to be a writer and that she wanted to make money. Two things which, of course, do not always go together. So she struggled and struggled to make herself into a writer. She had written some, what she called her blood and thunder stories for Frank Leslie's Illustrated News, very melodramatic stories which she was ashamed of, and she wrote them under a pseudonym. She had published some poems, she had published some stories, and in 1854, when she was 21, she decided that she would really, you know, become a writer, and that she would go and see the great editor of her time, of their time, James T. Fields. James T. Fields was Hawthorne's editor, he was De Quincey's editor, he was the man who would become the sort of Maxwell Perkins of the 1840s and 50s, a very famous guy. So Louisa had been, you know, she made money, some money from writing, some money from being a seamstress, some money from teaching, and she had gone to be a companion to a man who turned out to be very unpleasant in New Hampshire. And she had been there for 6 weeks, and she wrote an essay about it called When I Went Out to Service. So she thought she would take this memoir essay to James Fields and see what he thought, and he would anoint her as a writer, and she would be on her way. So I'm reading again. She passed the Boston Common and turned into the bustling center of downtown. There the spire of the Old South Church presided like a disapproving Puritan dowager over the teeming business of the New Boston. There was the bookshop next to Mrs. Abner's coffee house, where Fields took authors and colleagues for coffee and hot buns. There was the gorgeous palace of the music hall with its golden gaslit interiors, where Louisa had already been to see Madame Henriette Sontag sing Rossini, and where she had recently gone to hear Theodore Parker, one of her favorite speakers and a fervent abolitionist, demand equality for women. Now Louisa headed for the second floor of the old corner bookshop, where Fields had his office behind a green curtain that separated him from his young assistant, Thomas Niles, and the piles of manuscripts he had yet to read. She handed him the manuscript, her first and last memoir essay, How I Went Out to Service. He motioned her to sit and began to read. She could hear the noise of Thomas Niles' pen scratching and the chatter in the bookstore downstairs. The air smelled of paper and ink. Finally, the great James T. Fields, you know what's going to happen, looked up at her and delivered the verdict she would remember for the rest of her life. Stick to your teaching, Miss Alcott, you can't write. So this is a famous moment where she takes her life in her hands, she walks across the common and goes to see this guy, and he says, stick to your teaching, you can't write. And he actually encouraged her teaching. He actually loaned her $40 to help her start a school. So he really was trying to be nice. But of course, this is the moment at which she actually became a writer. As you all who are writers know, if you don't thrive on discouragement, you are not going to make it as a writer. I often think that the principal engine behind most writing is perversity. It may be that the principal engine behind most success is perversity. I mean, now there are these psychological studies that say we should have said to our children, you'll never amount to anything, so that they could have spent their energy proving us wrong, instead of saying to our children, you can do whatever you want, and they did whatever they wanted. But Louisa had this perversity, and you can see it in the apple scene, and you can see it all the way through her life, so that when James T. Field said to her, you can't write, something inside her went, oh yes, I can. And I do think this is a very, very interesting moment, but her trials were not over. She then decided that she was going to write a serious novel. And her serious novel, which I'm sure not many of you read, was called Moods. And it's a novel about a young woman who goes on a river trip with two men, a man very much like Henry David Thoreau, who she had a desperate crush on, and another, a man very much like Ralph Waldo Emerson, who she also had a crush on. And these three people travel up the river, and she ends up marrying the Emerson character and then realizing that she's in love with the Thoreau character. And it's a terrible book, and they all die in a shipwreck. That's how she solved the problem. But she thought it was a terrific book. She started it with an epigraph from Emerson, and she worked very hard on it. She had to cut it in half to get it published. That may sound familiar. And it finally came out in 1864, and it got terrible reviews. And the worst review it got was from a young man named Henry James, who was writing for the North American Review. And he wrote that what Alcott was trying to do in Moods had already been done better in Europe, and that her doctrine of affinities, which is what Moods was supposed to be about, made no sense. And then he wrote, we are utterly weary of stories about precocious little girls. The two most striking facts with regard to Moods are the author's ignorance of human nature and her self-confidence in spite of that ignorance. Nice, huh? So James and Alcott remain friends, however, and to me, it's a tribute to her that they stayed friends, and also, of course, she was a tremendous influence on Henry James. He went on to write many novels about precocious little girls, many with names very much like Louisa May Alcott characters. There's a lot of overlap. She wrote about Vevey, he wrote about Vevey. She wrote about Jo March, he wrote about Isabel Archer. In other words, you can see her influence on him, but it starts here with this really quite savage review. So all the information that she's getting is, you're a lousy writer, you're a lousy writer, you're a lousy writer. So this, of course, is fodder for her. And then what happened, another accident. The Civil War started, and of course the Civil War had a huge, disastrous, tragic effect on everything in Concord and everything in Boston. And Louisa May Alcott decided she couldn't just sit around, so she decided to become a Civil War nurse. And that was, a fairly radical decision in those days. And she got enlisted through a woman named Dorothea Dix, who was running the nursing service. Before then, most nurses had been men. And she went down to Washington, D.C., where she served as a nurse in the Union Hotel Hospital in Washington, D.C. And she got there, in many ways a complete innocent. And as it happened, the day after she arrived, General Ambrose Burnside ordered 14 unsuccessful charges on the hills of Fredericksburg. And so the Union carnage that day was unbelievable, which is a whole other story. But the next morning, Louisa May Alcott looked out the window of the hospital and she saw what she thought were farmers coming to market, a line of wagons that stretched out to the horizon. And of course, there were wagons filled with the wounded and the dead from Fredericksburg coming to her hospital. So she, who had never seen a naked man, set to nursing these poor men, many of them dying, many of whom died on her watch. She learned how to write letters to their families. She told them stories from Dickens. She did whatever she could, and she loved him. Everything that Louisa May Alcott hated, all the phoniness, all the niminy-piminy chits, all the shame about being endlessly poor, all the embarrassment about her father fell away, and it was really just life and death. And she not only became the woman that we know as Louisa May Alcott, but she found her mature writing style. And her letters home that she wrote from Union Hospital, there is nothing extraneous. They are vivid, they are beautiful, they are simple, they are humorous. They're just beautiful letters. She got very sick down there. She had a bronchial infection, and of course, in those days, in the 1860s, they thought that disease fed on the body, and so the more powerful the emetic, the better the healing would be, so they dosed everybody with mercury, and of course, everybody died. She didn't die, but she got very, very sick, so sick that Bronson had to go down and get her and bring her back to Concord, where she started to recover very slowly. She lost all her hair, her hands were all cramped up, she had to learn to write with her left hand. She was in bed for months, she was really sick. But Bronson took all these letters that she had written home with her help and made a little book, which is right here, called Hospital Sketches, which is an extraordinary book. It's a memoir of her time in the Civil War. You know, it's interesting that Walt Whitman was down there too. He had gone to Fredericksburg to look for his brother, George, and George, as it turned out, was okay. But Walt Whitman was so touched by what he saw at Fredericksburg that he also went to Washington and became a Civil War nurse. And so they were both in Boston marketing books about being Civil War nurses. And Whitman assured his publisher that he wasn't just going to write sketches, you know, like Louisa May Alcott did. Anyway, she wrote a wonderful book, and she really found her writing style under all those pressures. So, in 1868, when Thomas Niles, who was then her editor, came to her and said, the only book of yours I could really publish would be a book for young women, she was horrified. Did they ask Emerson to write a book for young women? Did they ask Thoreau to write a book for young women? She did not want to write a book for young women. She felt she had earned the right to write another serious book. And she said, of course, Louisa May Alcott, she said she would do it and didn't do it. And so what happened was Thomas Niles, who was sort of one of history's inspired bullies, wrote a letter to Bronson Alcott, you know, remember, the bad writer, saying, you know, if Louisa would write this book, we could publish your next book. And so Bronson Alcott got to work and started writing Louisa letters saying, you have to come home from Concord. I promise Mr. Niles that you're working on this book. And eventually she gave in and went back to Concord, and in February of 1868, and she stalled. She didn't want to do it. She's January, February, March, April. She did everything else but write this book. And finally, she sat down in May of 1868 and wrote it very fast. Of course, she wrote about her sisters. She wrote about what she knew. And of course, she didn't really write about her sisters. She did that thing, which I think often creates great literature. She wrote about the sisters she yearned to have. She wrote about the family she longed to have. She created a servant who did the work that Louisa herself had often done, Hannah, right? And instead of losing her hair to disease, she has Joe cut her hair off as a loving sacrifice. She didn't think the book was that great. Thomas Niles didn't think the book was that great, but as soon as it came out, letters started to pour in to both the publishing house and to Louisa May Alcott, and within 6 months, she was one of the best-selling writers in the world, and one of the wealthiest. Thomas Niles said, let me write you a check for whatever amount you like. So that was huge, and it took her a while to adjust to it. And she did a lot of other interesting, her life didn't end then, but in a way, that's sort of the middle of the story. You have to read the rest of the book to find out what happened after that. I just want to say, I think for Louisa May Alcott, the stick to your teaching line stayed in her mind. And she wrote a letter in 1871, long after she was beloved and wealthy and famous. She wrote a little letter to James Fields that I'm going to read to you. Dear Mr. Fields, Louisa wrote, once upon a time you lent me $40, kindly saying that I might return them when I had made a pot of gold. As the miracle has been unexpectedly wrought, I wish to fulfill my part of the bargain and herewith repay my debt with many thanks. Very truly yours, Louisa May Alcott. So I want to suggest a little bit that it isn't just perversity that is the engine for writing. There's a little bit of revenge in there. And I feel that when she sat down to write this letter to thank him for the $40 that she loaned him so that she could teach better, it was a tremendously satisfying moment. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how I came to write this book. It also was a series of unfortunate accidents, as you can imagine, or accidents at least. I was, in 1999, I started. I was chatting with my then literary agent on the phone, and she wanted to get me off the phone. And she said, Random House, there's my current literary agent who never wants to get me off the phone. Random House wants somebody to write an introduction to a new edition of Little Women. You could do that. I'm sending it to you. Click. So I thought, okay. And the book came, and I thought, well, I better reread Little Women. So I went out and got a copy of Little Women and reread it, and it knocked my socks off. I was amazed. I had no idea. It's a great novel. You know, by that time I had taught the novel. I knew a little bit about novels. I thought it was a great novel if you were a miserable 18-year-old who ate the apple. It actually is a great novel by any standards. So that got me started. And then I wanted to know everything about Louisa May Alcott, so I started with Martha Saxton's biography, and I read that Laurie in Little Women was based on Henry David Thoreau. So I went, he was? Now, it turns out he was based on a lot of people, including Henry David Thoreau, but I was stunned. I had no idea that Louisa May Alcott was part of this community of great men. No idea at all. To me, they existed in different parts of the forest. So the more I read, the more fascinated I got. And I got very fascinated with this Concord community, you know, this crossroads where all of American literature, in fact, was written, or most of American literature was written, certainly most of 19th century American literature. And Louisa May Alcott was right there in the middle of things. So I wrote a book about that, American Bloomsbury, about that group of people. And the more research I did about Louisa May Alcott, the more interested I got. What I did with American Bloomsbury was I thought, what if you took the Transcendentalist circle and put the women in? Because no one had done that. Many brilliant people wrote books about the Transcendentalists, but they always left out Louisa May Alcott and Margaret Fuller and Lydia and Emerson as if they weren't there. So I thought, well, what do you put? Well, what you get is, of course, sex and trouble and all kinds of things. But so that made it fun to write about. But I got more and more interested in Louisa May Alcott and more fascinated by the way the problems that she embodies in her life and dealt with in her work are the problems that we have today, that I have, that my daughter has. This tension between how to make a life for oneself, whether you should use your sexual currency to attract some guy who's going to take care of the money part, whether you should try to have a career on your own, whether you should try to do both at the same time. And that's really what she's writing about. And it's also what her life is about. She got very upset with the success of Little Women when she got hundreds of letters begging her to have Joe marry Laurie. And she wrote in her journal, I will not, under any circumstances, let Joe marry Laurie, right? But she kind of compromised and produced Professor Bear. But you know, she was upset by that. And when you sit in front of Orchard House in Concord, as you certainly should, it's an extraordinary place, you see, I mean, 100,000 people a year go there, and many of them are young women. And it's like, it looks like Mecca. I've never been to Mecca, but you know, they're walking up the path and they look as if, you know, these beautiful young women think that somehow they'll get some guidance, you know, from this wonderful woman, from this wonderful house and this work. And I think that, you know, although there are no answers in Little Women, that there's certainly clarity about this problem, which is really all anybody can give anybody else. So I got more and more obsessed with her, and I wrote this book. So I would love it if you ask me questions. As you may or may not know, Thoreau went to Walden not to write a book, but because he was writing another book about a river trip he had taken with his brother. And it was only at a lecture when everybody asked him what it was like to live in a hut on Walden Pond in the Q&A that he realized that he had a book there. So I'm a great believer in the magic of Q&A, which I hope we will indulge in. Thanks very much.